Sarah, are you still having problems with the volume?
It's very low.
Fine here.
I can hear you, but it's very low.
Okay, I'll try talk loudly as well.
Yes, scream.
A lot of it is actually by video in any case, so.
Okay.
Where do I have, never mind, I'd have to unmute everyone. I was going to ask where everyone's from, but I'm assuming most people here are in Israel. I know we have a few others, South Africa and Australia. I'll give it about 5 more minutes for anyone who wants to, about 5 more minutes for people to join, and then I'll start and people can come in as they sign up. I think that when we start properly, I will mute everyone for a couple of reasons. I think that one, it sounds better, and also I think it's low risk, but this event has been out on the internet, and I am a little bit worried that our friends in the BDS brigade could join and decide to be disruptive. It is an IDF, obviously there's a link to the IDF. So when I start, I will mute everyone and then unmute as I need to through the tour. And I'm going to say this now, I will say it again when I start, but we're looking, if this works successfully, I'm looking at doing another one of these tours on the Gaza, with communities around the Gaza border next week. We've got a general who until recently was the commander of Israeli forces on the border, who's agreed to join us live and to do a tour and then take questions with us, and a couple of other residents as well, from the area, which will hopefully be interesting for those who are interested in that sort of thing.
He's Australian.
Koonin.
I'll give it 1 more minute and then I'll start. And again, people whoever comes in late can come in late.
Told me that, or they found themselves?
No, they signed up themselves. Yeah. Yeah, also Hertzel, South Africa, Sweden.
Now we're unmuted. If you want to say hello now, you can.
Hi, Naomi.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hello, my love. How are you?
We're okay. Hanging
Good.
in there.
Yeah, we all are.
Guys, it's 38 past on my clock. I'll wait 1 more minute and then I'll start. There are still people joining, but I think that's fine.
Did you speak to him?
She just spoke on here because of the things on. Okay.
Oh, yes, what's his name?
Jamie. I can tell you who everybody is. I can go on and I'll tell you who the participants are. Right? Participants. Know any of these people?
How will I know?
She's from Jerusalem, Wistic. She's also from here.
Mute yourself if you don't mean ready. You're not on mute.
Yeah, I'm getting the same message.
You're on mute, Josh.
Okay, so was all of that lost?
Yes.
Yes, okay, so let me just start again. I apologize for that. So my name's Joshua Koonin. For those who don't know me, I know some do. I have been living in Israel for a few years now. I run a tour company called Pizzazz Israel Tours, and I'm also a licensed guide. We do general tours, and we also do a lot of sort of political-based tours where we bring journalists and politicians and those sort of people into the country. Now, I think like pretty much everyone in the tourism industry, I would much rather be out actually out guiding today, but obviously that's not possible. So we thank you for joining us on this virtual tour, and I do think it's a very important tour and site, obviously, and an important day. The tour is free, but it is obviously a very difficult time for the tourism industry generally. So and it did cost us some money to put this together. So if anyone is able to provide a tip or anything like that at the end, I would appreciate that. I'm just putting a link on the particularly, obviously, if you enjoy the tour, I'm putting a link in the chat now. Now, the way this is going to work is that we have filmed a lot of the tour, like we're out at Mount Hertzel. We're going to play that for you. And in between, I'm going to stop as we're moving from place to place, and we're going to talk, and I'm going to take questions as if we were actually at the site. I'll just unmute everyone for a second. Let's not do that. If anyone has any questions, the best way is probably going to be to put them into the chat box. and I'll take questions periodically when I stop stop our video. Part of this tour is not done by video, and part of it I will do from here, and I'll explain why when we get there. But thank you again all for coming. I'm going and hope you enjoy. Can everyone see the screen? Just 1 second. Could you all see that? I just want to make sure of that before I continue. Yep, great.
It's a little bit jumpy.
It's a little bit jumpy. I think it might be the internet where you are, but hopefully it'll sort itself out. We'll try our best. Okay. All right, we're here at Mount Hertzel. It's obviously a very different feeling to what we'd expect on a normal week, on a normal Memorial Day. Normally in the days leading up to Memorial Day, this entire place was packed, but today we had to come in the back entrance. The main entrance to the site is closed, and you can see that there's almost nobody around. One of the very sad things about what's happening now is that this year the bereaved families are not actually able to visit their relatives, their sons, their daughters' graves here at this cemetery or at any other cemetery around Israel today on Memorial Day. And that's why we thought that it would be appropriate to come here and bring you to the site from your own homes. And we're now at the entrance to Mount Hertzel, and I personally think that this is one of the most important sites in the entire state of Israel. It's a site that has a resonance with the Bible, in my opinion, because when you think about it, a leader by the name of David came and he gathered the disparate tribes of the Jewish people together. He created a powerful Jewish country, and he made Jerusalem the capital of that country. And in the center of Jerusalem, would say, he took a mountain, and on that mountain he built a site which was sacrosanct, to which Jewish people would come on pilgrimage, sometimes many times a year, 3-4 times a year. Almost sounds like it could be talking about the Temple Mount in the old city of Jerusalem, but not quite, because King David never built the temple on the Temple Mount. King David's son Solomon did that. King David was a man of war. He wasn't allowed to build the temple. David Ben Gurion, by contrast, came here, and in many ways, on this mountain where we are right now, Mount Hertzel, he built the temple, the pantheon of modern Israeli society, the place where Israelis would come on pilgrimage to remember, to give thanks to those who put down their lives so that the state of Israel could survive, could thrive, and could turn into what we see today. What I want to do in the next hour or so is to take you through this place, to take you through Mount Hertzel, and to show you some of the places, some of the leaders who were buried here, but more importantly, some of the almost 24,000 soldiers who laid down their lives for the state of Israel, to tell their stories, and by doing that, to try to understand both the significance of their sacrifice and also the way in which Israeli society has changed, the way it's remembered its soldiers has changed over time, and I think that very much reflects Israeli society more broadly. Just before we start, one thing that I should mention, we're on Mount Hertzel right now. We're also on the higher part of a larger mountain called Mount Remembrance here in Jerusalem, and lower down on this mountain is Yad Vashem, the National Holocaust Memorial and Museum. And rightly or wrongly, when this place was built, everything was very, very symbolic. And the leaders of the state of Israel back in the early years of the state, the leaders made a very clear decision. And that decision was that Mount Hertzel would be on top, the place where Israel's leaders are buried, the place where the soldiers who fell fighting for Israel are buried, and Yad Vashem would be below it. Now, without denigrating from those who were killed in the Holocaust, clearly, rightly or wrongly, the leaders of Israel were making a very symbolic statement that the better way to go, the better course is to die fighting and have this state of Israel for which we can fight. And I think that is very important in terms of the state of Israel. One other final thing before we start, I mentioned the old city and the historic part of Jerusalem, and the truth is that Mount Hertzel is not a place that you would necessarily have expected to become this pantheon, because back in 1948, there was a very clear cemetery, a place where Jews had been looking to be buried for 2,000 years. The Mount of Olives, right by the Old City, is a place that Jews had been coming to be buried in, and almost certainly, had been possible, the Mount of Olives would have become the national cemetery, and it would have been a continuation. There would have been this continuity of Jewish tradition of being buried there. But the Mount of Olives is in East Jerusalem, and in 1948 it falls into Jordanian hands. So Ben Gurion, as the national leader, in a time of war, realizes that he needs to create a new place, a new burial ground, a new place of national significance, right at the foundation of the modern state. And he chooses this place, which at the time is a barren hill, and it's going to become Mount of Remembrance, the mountain on which both Yad Vashem and National Military Cemetery are situated. Okay, I do see that a couple of people are, okay, I can see that some people are having problems with the audio. So what I think I'm going to do, what I'll try to do is to continue with the video, but I will talk, and we will silence the video itself. What was broadly said there was that this was a place that was I think most people did get it, but this is the place that was chosen as this pantheon, but really because, and I think this is significant, the Mount of Olives was the place where Jews were buried. It's still the place that religious Jews want to be buried to this very day. But in 1948, the Mount of Olives is captured by Jordan, and Ben Gurion has to find a new place to bury Israel's leaders, to bury its national heroes, the soldiers who have fallen in the War of Independence, 1% of the entire population. And he finds this barren hill, which has never really had any significance in the center of Jerusalem, and he takes it and he makes it this almost religious-like mountain in the center of the city. Now, what the next place that I would take you to are people. I understand people are having a lot of trouble with the video, correct? Are people having trouble hearing the video? Okay.
It's a bit jumpy.
It's a bit jumpy?
Yeah, it sort of sounds quite skippy.
Okay. I am going to try to, in that case, I will try, I'll try.
I think it's mainly because
So I will, I'll try to see if I can turn my volume. I'll try to see if I can talk to the rest of the video, but there was also a question about when Mount Hertzel was built. It's built, it's created at the start of the state, but it's built as initially, it's not necessarily like I don't think that Ben Gurion quite envisaged the significance that it would have for the next 72 years. I think that initially this was a place because they needed to bury Hertzel and the fallen of 1948 somewhere, and the idea was that another place would probably be found. It wasn't a place of great significance right from the very start, and that is the place we find. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to continue. I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to share the video, but I will try to talk. In fact, maybe I'll just share my screen without playing, and I'll talk through the next site that we're at. So what I will do now, since you are having trouble hearing this video, what I will do is I'll keep talking instead. And right now, the next place that we took everyone to was the grave of Zev Jabotinsky. Now, there is a reason that we went there. Obviously, you come on a tour of Mount Hertzel. The place that you would ordinarily go is the grave of Hertzel himself. But because of the setup of the events of today, we couldn't actually get close to Hertzel's grave. And when we tried to go near it and film, we were told very quickly to go away by security. So we decided we'd film here instead. And we talk a little bit about Hertzel. I think everyone here pretty much knows the story, so I'll do it in 30 seconds. Herzl he's an irreligious Jew. He he has very little connection to Judaism, really. He's a reporter in Europe, and he covers this trial of another irreligious Jew, Alfred Dreyfus, who's put on trial for treason by the French. And as Hertzel is standing there as a reporter watching this trial, he hears the crowd shouting, "Death to the Jews, death to the Jews." And he's fairly shocked, because he realizes Dreyfus, much like him, has no real connection to Judaism other than by birth. And he comes to the conclusion that Jews will never be able to escape anti-Semitism except in their own country. This is all happening in France, which is the most liberal society of the world in 1894 when it's happening. Hertzel goes away. He starts a movement to create a Jewish state, and he ultimately doesn't live to see that happen. He dies in 1904, but in his final will and testament, he asks to be buried at the invitation of the Jewish government of the Jewish state. One of the first things that happens when the Jewish state is created is that Theodor Hertzel is invited to be buried here. There are huge parades that occur, not parades, but his body is brought through and given a huge guard of honor, and that happens back in 1949. Now, the other grave, the grave that we're actually standing at, is kind of the grave that has the second place of highest significance on the mountain, and that's Zev Jabotinsky, who's the leader of the revisionist Zionist movement. Jabotinsky is more controversial than Hertzel in that he's more militant to the British in many ways, when they come to rule here, but he's also a visionary in certain aspects, certainly that can't be disputed. For example, when Ben-Gurion is talking about supporting the Turkish in World War I, Jabotinsky says we need to get out and support the British because they're going to win here, and that's to our advantage. And Jabotinsky if Hertzel creates the mainstream Zionist movement, Jabotinsky creates another very, very big movement, and he's the second leader who has his own sort of area on this cemetery. It's just across from Hertzel, and given that we can't go to Hertzel on this particular day, we thought we should stand here and tell both of their stories. You can see, and I know some people know this, but you can see that there are rocks on the grave, and we know that there's a Jewish tradition to place rocks on a grave, and I think that there are two reasons for that. One is a symbolic reason, and we'll see that through the cemetery. One is a symbolic reason that a rock doesn't fade like a flower. The soul doesn't fade. The other is purely practical. Jews are a people of the desert. The Middle East is a desert region. In the desert, if you die and you're buried, animals will eat what's left of you unless you can cover up with rocks. And we see those stones there. One last thing about Jabotinsky, and I'll go to some, and then I'll check if anyone has any questions or comments. But Jabotinsky is different to Hertzel. Jabotinsky, like Hertzel, writes that he wants to be buried in the Jewish state at the invitation of Jewish government. David Ben-Gurion refuses to issue the invitation to Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion hated each other, and unlike Hertzel, Jabotinsky is a contemporary of Ben-Gurion. He dies before the state's created in 1940, but he's very much there with Ben-Gurion through a lot of the foundation of the Zionist movement. Ben-Gurion refuses to bring Jabotinsky's remains to Israel, and Jabotinsky actually waits until Ben-Gurion leaves office in 1964, and Ben-Gurion's successor, Levi Eshkol, almost immediately issues the invitation for Jabotinsky to come and be buried not only in Israel, but at a place of very special significance on Mount Hertzel. Now, I don't want to get into politics too much today, but by the time Ben-Gurion resigns, him and Levi Eshkol are not on the best of terms. And you can imagine that it may not be an entirely altruistic thing to have Jabotinsky brought up here. There's also a sense of maybe sticking it to your predecessor if you want, showing you're your own man, and maybe that's why this comes here. He's brought here then. But in any case, Jabotinsky is the second big grave here. Just for those who've just joined, we have a video, but some people were struggling to hear it. So I'm using it more as pictures for the moment and taking you through. And I will also get to the soldiers themselves, which are the main reason for any tour of Mount Hertzel. But before I continue, are there any other questions that come up from what we've said so far? And is it, I'm not going to unmute because it's very difficult when everyone's unmuted, but if there are any questions in the chat box, I'd be more than happy to take them. No? Okay, so we'll continue. I do want to just briefly continue to a lot of what was said here was what I've just taken you through, but I do want to now continue to another section that we really should go to before we go to before we go to the soldiers themselves at Mount Hertzel. There is another section that I do have to take you through, and that is, if anyone's unmuted, it would be great. If you could mute, that would be fantastic. There is another section that I do need to take you to do this properly, and that is the leaders. They call it the greats among the nation. And my question is, who are the greats among the nation? We see one of them here. I think it's kind of interesting, and I also think it tells us a little bit about some of our leaders who are buried here. The question being, who constitutes a great among the nations? Now, there are three categories, and I'll give you two of them. Prime ministers and presidents are fairly obvious. There's a third one that not many people, that people don't necessarily think of automatically. And this is a category that was decided on by Ben-Gurion right at the beginning of the state. Ben-Gurion says, we need to have the speakers of the Knesset buried here. Why? Ben-Gurion says at the beginning of the state that Israel is a democracy, the parliament needs to be given a very special status, and therefore the speakers of the Knesset are going to be buried up here on Mount Hertzel together with the presidents and the prime ministers, who are generally thought of as the most significant figures here in the state. There is some criticism of that. There are people who suggest that that perhaps Nobel Prize winners should have the right to be buried here, perhaps great authors, people like Shai Agnon, for example, but that is the rule that's been established. The government of the day can invite others to be buried here as well. It's only done that once in the history of the state, and I will come to that in a moment or two. I will say that this is going to be a very controversial thing in the next 10, 15, 20, I mean, I hope in the long term, because we don't want anyone to die, but there are three figures that meet this criteria who are very, very problematic for the government of Israel. The first is a guy named Avram Berg, which some of us might know. He was Speaker of the Knesset and therefore has a right to be buried here. After he served as both Speaker of the Knesset and actually also President of the World Zionist Organization, Avram Berg decided that Zionism is an outdated and evil ideology, and he's been campaigning for Israelis to take up citizenship in other countries around the world. And you can imagine that the government of Israel doesn't really want him up here among the greats of the nation. Next, we have Ehud Olmert, who definitely has a right to be, where was Shai? I've got a question. Where was Shai Agnon buried? Shai Agnon is buried in an ordinary cemetery in Jerusalem. And I will, he was buried in an ordinary cemetery in Jerusalem. And just to get back to what I was saying, there is a problematic element right now in that we have Avram Berg. Next, we have Ehud Olmert, who has a right to be buried here, undoubtedly. Ehud Olmert was obviously convicted of corruption and spent some time in jail. Ehud Olmert has said that he wants to be buried here. We haven't heard anything from Avram Berg, although he has hinted that as a matter of free speech, as he sees it, he also wants to be. And finally, we have Moshe Katsav, convicted of rape, 7 years in jail. And you can imagine that too is very, very problematic. Interestingly, if you ask me who Israelis saw as most problematic of the three, I'd say probably Moshe Katsav, without a doubt. I'd probably say that Avram Berg is seen by them as more problematic than Olmert, which is interesting because Avram Berg hasn't been convicted of any crime, and there's no suggestion, as far as I know, that he's committed any crime. In terms of who we actually have buried here, we say prime ministers, presidents, and Speaker of the Knesset have the right, but who is actually buried here? Because not every prime minister is going to be. Firstly, David Ben-Gurion, the man who establishes all of this, is not buried on Mount Hertzel. Most of us know the story, but Ben Gurion in the early 50s is going down the road to Eilat, where a new, which the new road's being inaugurated. On the way down, he sees some tents and some animals on the side of the road with some young people. He tells his driver to stop. He says to the people, "What are you doing here?" They say, "We're establishing a new kibbutz out in the desert. We're calling it Sde Boker." Ben Gurion says, "This is the most amazing thing I've ever heard. I want to join." You can imagine these people kind of saying, "Okay, Prime Minister, sure, why not?" Laughing at him. Ben Gurion finishes inaugurating the road in Eilat. He comes back to Jerusalem, and not too long afterwards, he calls his personal secretary in, says, "We're resigning and we're going to that place in the desert." You can imagine his personal secretary looks at him and says, "What are you talking about? What place in the desert?" Drives down to the kibbutz, turns up unannounced and says, "I've come to join." There's actually a very big debate among the kibbutz members about whether to accept him, because he's an old man and you can't imagine him milking the cows at 6 a.m. But he does it. During another crisis, he's brought back to the prime ministership. He moves back to Jerusalem. He subsequently goes back to the desert again after he resigns. And there are people who are critical of Ben Gurion, but I think it's fair to say that he was an incredible visionary in that Ben Gurion said, if I live out in the desert and I'm buried out in the desert, this will force world leaders to come out into the desert. And that is what happens to this very day. People come to visit Ben Gurion's grave. So Ben Gurion is not buried up here. Our second prime minister is someone who almost nobody knows, unfortunately, and a man by the name of Moshe Sharet. He's not buried here either. The reason that Moshe Sharet is not buried here is because Moshe Sharet was a great lover of the city of Tel Aviv. That was his passion in life. He wanted to be buried in Tel Aviv, and he's buried at the Trumpeldor Cemetery in Tel Aviv. And then we come to our third prime minister, and that is once again, apologize, that's just closed for a second. We come to our third prime minister. Levi Eshkol is buried up here. Levi Eshkol is prime minister at the time of the Six-Day War. At the time, he's not given much credit for winning the war, but today most historians think that he was a brilliant tactician and very much helped to both win the war and build up the state. We continue on. We come to Golda, again, buried up here. I think Golda is an interesting character in that, I do this tour a lot in person, and when I go up here with Israelis, they don't have a great view of Golda. When you go up with Americans, and we do have Americans on here, Golda is this champion of feminism who brought the Israeli cause to the world, and they love her. They absolutely love her, and there's complete disconnect when it comes to Golda Meir. A couple of things we can say about her. Prior to becoming prime minister, she was an incredible servant of the state of Israel. Ben Gurion called her the woman who saved the state because of the money she raised for weaponry prior to the establishment of the state. He also used to call her the only member of his cabinet with balls. Take from that what you like. Golda dies, she's buried up here, and really Golda always wanted to be up here. Yitzhak Rabin, who people forget is the next prime minister because he was prime minister in the 70s as well as in the 90s. He is buried up here. His grave looks different to every other grave on Mount Hertzel because, of course, he's assassinated in 1995. Rabin again I once came up here with a tour guide, another guide. He said to me, Rabin is the only prime minister who could never have been buried anywhere else, because Rabin is the man who leads the battle for Jerusalem in 1947, 1948, and his soldiers are spread out among all of Mount Hertzel below him, and Rabin really had to be buried up at the top of the mountain. One other anecdote I really love about Rabin, that before I move on, Rabin is ambassador to the United States immediately after he serves as chief of staff in 1967. He finishes in 68, and while he's in, and hopefully people don't know this one, but while he's serving as chief of staff while he's serving as ambassador in the United States, he's a great general. He's giving advice to the Americans about the Vietnam War, and Kissinger writes about how he once threw a stapler at the head of the Joint Chiefs, screaming at him, how is it that the only general who can tell me how to beat the Viet Cong is the Israeli ambassador to Washington, D.C. I just got a comment that Begin is not buried there. That is absolutely correct. Begin is not buried on the Mount Hertzel. He is buried on the Mount of Olives. The reason Begin is not buried here is firstly, Begin is the only prime minister who's actually a fairly traditional Jew, and he wants to be buried on the Mount of Olives, which is the traditional site of burial. But actually, Begin, prior to the establishment of the state, there are two fighters who are captured by the British and are sentenced to death. One is Feinstein and the other is Barzani. Feinstein's Ashkenazi, Barzani is, I believe, Yemenite, Mizrahi in any case. And during the 1980s, when Begin is prime minister, there's a lot of ethnic tension between Ashkenazim and Sfardim, and Feinstein and Barzani actually die together. They are to be executed together, and they're going to be executed together. They commit suicide together before they're able to be executed. And Begin says they're buried quite close together. Begin says that he wants to be buried exactly halfway between Feinstein and Barzani on the Mount of Olives in order to show equality between Sfardim and Ashkenazim. And that's where he is buried. So that's Begin. Shimon Peres is buried up here. I put him next. He is the next prime minister here. He's also next to Rabin, which is kind of ironic because they hated each other. So the government of Israel ensured they would forever lie next to one another on Mount Hertzel. The other prime minister who is up here is Yitzhak Shamir, who's sometimes forgotten from the 1980s, early 90s. Begin is not here, Ben Gurion is not up here, Moshe Sharet is not up here, and Arik Sharon is not up here on Mount Hertzel. Ariel Sharon, the prime minister's wives have a right to be buried up here on Mount Hertzel with them, but Ariel Sharon has two wives and both of them die before he becomes prime minister. So they don't know that he'll have this right. And when Sharon dies, or before he suffers his stroke, in his will, he's written that he wants to be buried between his two wives on his family property, and that's where Sharon is buried. They're actually sisters. One dies and then he falls in love with the other one. His property is very close to Gaza, which creates all sorts of problems on the anniversary of his death every year. I mentioned that the government of Israel can invite others to be buried here. There's been one person who's had that invitation and who's accepted it in the history of the state. And it's this man, Teddy Kollek, who was the mayor of Jerusalem for many, many years. So that is a bit about this section, the greats among the nation. And if anyone has any questions, I would love to have them. Otherwise, I will take you into the military section of the cemetery, which is what we're really here to explore, I think. Okay, I'll continue down. Now, what I want to do with, again, I'm going to start this video, but I'm not going to, I will guide it myself. I'll just use it as pictures. As we're walking, I do want to point out, just before we go into the military section, just here there is a memorial to the victims of terror, because today is Yom Hazikaron, and everyone knows that it's a memorial to the nearly 24,000 soldiers who laid down their lives defending the state of Israel. But it is very important for me to mention that it's also the day on which we remember the victims of terror who've fallen in as Israelis, as Jews around the world, and they have a place here. They have a memorial up here on Mount Hertzel as well, and that is something that most people forget and which should not be forgotten. Okay, I want to take you guys now we are in the actual, we're in the military section of the cemetery, and I'm having a look at this grave in front of me. It's an ordinary soldier's grave. And what I think is significant about this is that every grave on Mount Hertzel, at least for the first many decades of the state of Israel, is going to look exactly like this. And what I want to do as we go through this part of the tour, is the main part of the tour, is to not just talk about the soldiers themselves. I want to tell their stories, but I also want to look at the way that they're buried and how that reflects a change in Israeli society over many, many decades. And I think that it's very, very interesting. If we look at the original, how the graves looked originally, what we see is that we have here the person's name. So I assume most people can read Hebrew, but for those who can't, the soldier's name is Pinchas. Pini tells us who his parents were. And then it tells us that he fell in fulfilling his duty, the date on which he fell, and the day on which he and the age at which he fell. And that's the standard that we have for most of these soldiers initially. I may just play the video for just a second here to get us to the right spot, because there is something very, very interesting that I want you all to see. just bear with me exact 1 second, but we're going to see the start of a change to that. We're going to see the start of a change to that very, 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 very standard pattern of grave. And by the way, what we see is also that the person's military ID number is there. But the grave of, say, a general and a private is going to look absolutely identical, at least back in 1948 and right up to the 1980s. These are soldiers who fell in the 80s here in the First Lebanon War. Now, I want to take you across to this grave here. This is a different grave completely, and I want to see if anyone can anyone tell me in the chat what is different about this grave specifically? Anyone? Okay.
His age.
His age.
His Ramatkal, his Ramatkal.
So firstly, so we see a couple of things about this grave. Firstly, and no one's got what I'm actually looking for. So firstly, so first of all, so there's a few interesting things about this grave. Firstly, the man is 67 years old, and we can assume that he probably didn't die in battle at age 67, which is absolutely correct. We also see that it says niftar, he passed away, not he fell, which is what it says about every other soldier. This man is the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Force. And when you reach a certain rank, I think it's any general in the IDF, you have the right to be buried up here on Mount Hertzel, regardless of how you die. So this man has taken up his right. It says that he was the chief of staff. He was the second chief of staff of the IDF, and he basically commanded the War of Independence. And we see he was 67 years old. He's buried alongside the soldiers who died in the 1980s, because he dies in the 1980s. A general is not buried in a special section. But in any case, this man dies in the 1980s, and he is 67 years old. It says that he passed away, but no one has quite got what I was looking for. For those who read Hebrew well, we know that we have vowels. In Hebrew, you have vowels that come under a person's name. When you're learning, it's basically something kids use when they're learning to read. It's a reading aid. And if you look at any of the other words on this grave, the man's name is right at the top. If you look at any of the other words, for those who don't read Hebrew, there are no dots under the man's name. There are no dots under any other words like there are under his name, but there are dots under this man's name. This man's name is Yigael Yadin. Throughout, he was a very famous man. He was a great general. He later became the main excavator of Masada. He became a government minister, I believe. Yigael Yadin used to always be called Yigal Yadin whenever he went on TV. That's what when an Israeli reads this name without dots, they read Yigal. There are lots and lots of Yigals in Israel and very few Yigaels. And Yigael Yadin used to get very, very upset when he would be called Yigal. And when Yigael Yadin dies in the 1980s, his wife comes to the prime minister. She says, listen, he used to do interviews all the time and nothing hurt him more than being called Yigal. Please, Prime Minister, it's not a big thing to ask. Let me put these two dots under his name. The Prime Minister thinks, and he brings it to the cabinet. This actually becomes a cabinet discussion, and he says, okay, he was a hero of the state. We will allow these two dots under Yigael Yadin's name in order that people will say the name properly. It was something that really influenced him, and that is something that happens back then, but it's going to create a chain of events that we're going to see through the rest of our tour. And that is, together with the stories of the soldiers, what I'd like to show you for the rest of this tour now. Any questions just before we proceed in the chat? Okay, nothing. So let's go back to our shared, let's go back to this film then. We're going to continue from Yigael Yadin's grave. As I said, the two dots, very, very significant at the outset. And now I'm going to try to tell some stories of people who are... I am providing a recording. I just heard that, saw that. Yigael Yadin, and I'm also happy to send this video as well, but Yigael Yadin starts this chain chain reaction, and we will continue with that as we go through the grave. But I also want to start telling some of the stories about different monuments that we have here on Mount Hertzel. And the next place we're looking at right now, what we're looking at is the hills going out from Jerusalem towards Tel Aviv. And we see this hilly landscape. And then we come to this here. And this is what it looks like is a mass grave, which is strange because there's no concept of mass graves in Judaism. And there are very, very few mass graves in the cemetery, but there are a few. It means that something significant has happened. It means that we could not tell whose body parts were whom. It must have been a very, very significant battle. Now, remember those hills I was just showing you? This is a monument not too far from Yigael Yadin. It's a monument to the people who fell at the Battle of the Castel. In 1947, in 29th of November 1947, the United Nations votes to partition the British Mandate of Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. The Jews broadly say yes, the Arabs say no. The British say we don't care, we're leaving in May 1948, and they stop interfering in the conflict between the two sides, and almost immediately a civil war starts. By April 1948, just before the British are going to leave, before Israel's going to declare independence, the Jews have basically won the civil war in every area except Jerusalem. But the Jews have a very, very big problem because they're cut off in Jerusalem. A significant proportion of the population is living in Jerusalem, the Jewish population. Jerusalem is a very, very symbolic city. And the Jews know that if they can't save Jerusalem, Jewish Jerusalem, not only is a significant part of the population potentially going to lose their lives, the Jordanians, who are likely to attack when the British leave, the Jordanians are going to have a very, very easy path up. And from there, they can go down to the coastal plain towards Tel Aviv. Jerusalem is in a very, very bad state because we saw those hills a moment ago. Jerusalem has no way to create supplies, food for itself. It all has to come up from Tel Aviv. It's a hilly landscape. There is only one road that comes up from the coast that is accessible to the Jews in 1948. And on all of those hilltops we saw around us, there are Arab villages. Those villages are involved in the civil war. And what they're doing is every time they see the Jews trying to bring up food from their villages, they can see a long, long way away. They go down, fighters in those villages, they block the roads, they attack the convoys, and this creates a dual benefit because on one hand, they're helping the national effort, the civil war, and on the other hand, if you claim this food, you're also able to use it. And this is a time of great poverty. And these villages let's be clear, they're suffering. Everyone is suffering here. In April 1948, Ben Gurion gives the order saying, we have to overcome this problem. We've got to clear the path to Jerusalem. And he orders an operation called Operation Nachshon to clear the way to Jerusalem. And he sends his troops out to take village after village along these hilltops. And the toughest battle that the Jews are going to face is at one particular village called the Castel. And this is what this grave refers to. True, the Jews attack the Castel on the 2nd of April, 1948. They actually capture it fairly easily, but unlike the other villages, the Arab forces decide that they are not going to give up the Castel. They also realize that it's the last village looking out towards Jerusalem. For those who don't know, but do know Israel, the Castel is at a place called Mevatzeret Zion today. The Jews take the Castel fairly easily, but the Arabs come back with massive forces and they launch wave after attack, and the Jews have not left enough soldiers up there. The troops that have taken it, many of them have continued down in towards Jerusalem itself. And for 6 days, there's battle after battle or 5 days until the night of the 7th to the 8th of April. The night of the 7th to the 8th of April, a couple of things happen. Firstly, on that night, the Arab commander, Abdul Khadr al-Husseini, goes up to survey what's going on, the Jewish positions. Jews still hold the Castel. And it's a very, very misty night, and a Jewish sentry hears a voice in the Abdul Khadr al-Husseini feels that he can do this because it's a very dark, misty night. And a Jewish sentry hears someone in the crowd, in the distance, in the mist. He thinks it's probably not one of his troops. He fires, and to his own surprise, he later discovers he's killed the Arab commander. The Jews take the body back up to the top, and the Arabs, they don't quite know what's happened to their commander. They launch a ferocious attack. They capture the castle. The Jews are defeated. The Jews are gone. When the Arabs get up to the top, they find their commander. And the Jews think they've lost the castle, but what they don't realize is that without their commander, the Arab forces don't quite know what to do. They actually take the body down. They all go to Jerusalem. They have this huge funeral. They bury him by the Temple Mount. And the Jews, much to their surprise, the next morning realize that all the Arab forces are gone. They literally walk up. They raise the flag over the castle, and this time they bring enough men. It's very easy now to get men in. They haven't been able to get reinforcements in, but now they can. All the Arabs are gone, and the castle never comes into question again. But this is a very, very bloody battle. When the Jews retake the castle the second time, they find that they've lost over 30 men and women as well, and they can't really identify who's who. A lot of the bodies have been mutilated, and they just don't know who's who. So they know who's missing. They collect all these body parts together and they bring them to Mount Hertzel for, after the state's credit, they bring the remains for burial here. They're buried in a mass grave with the names of everyone, simply because we don't know who's buried where. And that's this monument here that we have of the fighters of the Castel. Something that I think is worth mentioning, something we often, so I think there's actually a sense of reverse racism, if you'd like, reverse racism maybe, in that we tend to, maybe not racism, that's not the right word, but I think we sometimes give ourselves a little bit too much credit when we talk about how the Israelis won the Jews won the war. We talk about the Arabs being massively outnumbering us, and these poor Jews fighting underarmed, and there is truth in all of that, but the truth is also that the Jews were very, very well commanded, because the Jews, or at least their commanders, had overwhelmingly joined the British army to fight against the Nazis. People like Yitzhak Rabin and Moshe Dayan, and the Jews had a very, very professional command structure. The Arabs did not. They were very disorganized. We see this in the story of the Castel. Abdul Qadir al-Husseini was the one leader, was the one Arab military commander who was very, very good, who had been holding his own. And it's hard to know what would have happened if Abdul Qadir al-Husseini hadn't been killed in what was really a freak occurrence up on the Castel. A soldier shooting into the mist and getting a lucky hit. The war may have turned out very, very differently. I'm going to move on, but any questions about all of that just before we do that? Okay, let me take you forward a little bit. We're going to stick with this. And just bear with me a second. We come here to, and I'll just do this one very quickly, we come here to another mass grave. Once again, we don't know where these people are actually, where their body parts lie. This grave relates to a place called Kfar Etzion. Kfar Etzion is, as many of you would know, today it's a settlement or a community in Gush Etzion. And sometimes we hear about the settlements or the communities over the Green Line, whatever you want to call them, as places established after 1967. In Gush Etzion specifically, there were 4 small communities that existed prior to the partition plan of 1947. Kfar Etzion is one of them. In 1948, as the Jordanians are advancing, Kfar Etzion is left isolated. They managed to evacuate the women and children, or most of the women, at least one parent of every family. They managed to evacuate most of the women and children, or at least a parent and a child, because some of the women do fight in 48 and fight instead of their husbands. But in any case, they put up a very brave fight at Kfar Etzion. Ultimately, they are forced to surrender. And when they surrender, they're out of arms. The Jordanian commanders call the Jews together, and they say, we want to take a photo to commemorate the event of your surrender. They gather the fighters together. They they line them up close together, and then as they look like they're going to take a photo, these people are massacred by machine guns. To be fair to the Jordanians, it's unclear whether this is something that they wanted to do or if it was a lone soldier who started this. But in any case, the people of Kiryat Zion are massacred. Later, the Jews managed to recover, the Israelis managed to recover their body parts, and like the fighters of the Castel, they are buried in a mass grave. Something that is quite interesting is that every single year for the next 19 years, the children who were evacuated from Kiryat Zion are brought here to this mass grave on Yom Hazikaron. And immediately afterwards, they go to the one place where you can see a lone tree that stood at Kiryat Zion. And they would stand there and they would talk about going back to their community one day. In 1967, Israel captures the territory, whatever you want to call it, the territory of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. I don't want to go into politics, but Israel captures territory, including Kiryat Zion. And the children of Kiryat Zion, who are actually kibbutznikim, I mean, this was a kibbutz, a left-leaning kibbutz, go to Prime Minister Eshkol and Defense Minister Dayan, and they say, we have been talking about going there to honor our parents for the last 19 years, to honor the people who fell defending us. Let us go and create this place. And this becomes the first Jewish town, community, settlement, whatever you want to call it, in 1967. And I think that it's interesting that is actually how that came about, a story connected directly to Yom HaZikaron and to this day. One other thing, the third mass grave that we have on Mount Hertzel relates to the defenders of the old city, who again are buried in a mass grave and who we can't identify immediately after the war. And there is one in particular who's quite well known. Her name is Esther Kallingold, and she writes a very, very famous letter back to her parents as she's defending the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem as the British are as it becomes clear that she's going to die. She's been hit, and she writes what becomes a very, very, she writes the words that are buried. It's going to be difficult for me to find. We just got one photo of it on this video. It's going to be difficult for me to find that, but she writes words that become very, very immortal. She writes somewhat similar to Trumpeldor, for those who know him. She writes, she's a girl of 18, I think, and she writes, "Dear Mommy and Daddy," and at the end of her letter, she says, do not cry for me, for through our efforts, a Jewish state is about to come into being. I see that there's a question about boxes that you see. Those boxes are to light a candle. Now they're generally you'll see them on a lot of the graves around Mount Hertzel. In Jewish tradition, on the anniversary of the person's death, you light a memorial candle on their grave. Obviously here we don't actually know whose grave is who, but in any case, the living relatives, or where there are no living relatives, the representatives of the IDF, and particularly the unit these people fought in, will come and will light a candle in each box for all of them. Actually today, because today, I don't know who saw the news last night, but one thing that is happening is that the army has been going grave to grave, because you aren't allowed in the cemeteries. The army's been going grave to grave, lighting candle, placing tokens of memorial on every grave, and also lighting candles. I also point out that, again, like what we saw earlier, these graves are, it's a little bit difficult to see, but you can see they're not very personalized. Perhaps here it's because these are mass graves, but they're not, they all look the same. And again, that's something that we're going to discuss as we keep going just a little bit further. Now, if we continue along from there, again, using our video for its pictures only, I want to take you to another grave, and who can tell me what the issue with this grave is on the chat? Nobody?
Oh,
But those little, he was 17.
He was 17 years old. Ratzon Badani, 17 years old. Now, let me start by telling you that the Israeli Defense Force does not accept people who are under 18. It has never accepted people who are under 18, not even in its darkest hour, as the Arab force, 6 Arab armies are attacking in 1948. So how do we end up with Ratzon Badani, who is 17 years old, buried up here on Mount Hertzel? There are two possibilities. Firstly, Ratzon Badani could very easily have, it doesn't mention where he was born either. Someone has just said that. That has caused me to think. What I was about to say to you all was that there are two ways this could come about. The first way is that Ratzon Badani could have been a Holocaust survivor. Now, when you go into the camps when you went into the camps, if you were, say, 14 years old, 12 years old, which you would have had to have been, you were always told, as you arrived off the train, many, or not always, but very often, prisoners would come up to the new inmates and say to them, don't say you're 12, say you're 14, say you're 15. If anyone's read Night by Elie Wiesel, he speaks about this explicitly. If you were older, you had more chance of being sent to the side of life. Now, you can imagine that through selection after selection after selection, over the course of years, this may become ingrained in you. And when you get off the boat as a refugee and someone says to you, how old are you? Just say you're older than you are. And your whole family's dead. There's no one to contradict it. So they say, okay, they give you an ID, and later on somehow discover that that's not the case. That's one possibility. Now, I was going to say to you all, I don't think that's what happened here, because Ratzon sounds like, to me, Ratzon Badani sounds like a Yemenite name, someone who was probably in this land before 1948. There is another possibility, and that possibility is this. In 1948, 1% of the Jewish population is going to be killed. This is a war. There are 6 armies attacking. The Jews don't know if they're going to survive, and they know what happens if they lose the war. They're, the men, women, children, old people, they're going to be massacred. There is very clear talk about driving the Jews into the sea. And you can imagine if you're Ratzon Badani, for example, and you are 17 years old and 10 months, and you've gone through high school with a group of boys and girls who are now on the front lines defending your mother and your father and your grandparents and your little sister and brother, and you go off you take yourself off to the enlistment office and say, I want to fight, and they say, sorry, we don't take 18-year-old, we only take you from 18, you can imagine you might not be too happy. And what a lot of these people actually did was they went out and they bought fake ID, just like people do today, but to join the IDF. I was going to say that's what I thought happened to Ratzon Badani. I don't know for sure. However, I had not noticed that it doesn't say where he's born. In fact, it does say where he was born. I've just seen it here. It says that he was born in Yemen. So that is what would have happened to him. If it hadn't said where he was born, that would have suggested that maybe he was actually a Holocaust survivor, and we just don't know for sure where he was actually born. We somehow discovered later that he was younger than we thought. But it does say he was born in Yemen. There was a very significant Yemenite. Most Yemenite Jews came to Israel after it was created, but there was a significant proportion that came in the years before the state. And actually, if we go just behind Ratzon, I'm just trying to run forward just a touch, we have another one of these young boys, and I call them boys very deliberately. We have one. We're still with Ratzon, but if we continue here, we have Eliyahu Elisha, who was, if you look carefully, was 15 years old on the date that he fell. Again, most likely, we don't know exactly. If I had to guess with him, he was probably a Holocaust survivor, just because 15 would be pretty difficult to get a fake ID. But if you were coming from the camps and then a DEP camp, etc., it may have been harder to tell who was really 15 and who was really 18. Born in Iraq, my mistake. The youngest person buried I see is 12 or 13. That's correct. The youngest person to die in 1948 was 10 years old. He was a runner in the Jewish quarter. In fact, let me rephrase what I was saying. The youngest person to die was 10 years old. He was a young boy who they would use in the defense of the Jewish quarter to run from position to position carrying messages, and he was shot by a sniper. Now, he is actually buried on Mount Hertzel because all of the remains were, they have remains of these people on Mount Hertzel, but the youngest person in an individual grave is 12 or 13. Questions in chat? Okay. Let me go forward one more time through our video, and I want to now go forward. We're going to jump forward now from 1948. We are going to jump forward quite a bit, and I want to take you to this next section. And I want you to just see this little clip of video. This is now the 1970s. Don't worry about the sound. I'll repeat everything that was said afterwards, but I want you to just look at this clip and start to see what's the change in the grave that we have here as things progress into the more modern era. How this collectivism, how every grave looking the same, just starts to change ever so slightly. I will talk as soon as this is played, and I'll jump forward just a little bit. If we have a look, we're seeing flowers on the graves which didn't exist. This just takes a second, but we see flowers here. Roses. People are starting to just a little bit, it just makes these ever so slight changes. Nothing particularly drastic at this point, but I would suggest to you that the 1970s is the period where the state of Israel starts to depart from the collectivism, from its socialist roots. By the end of the 70s, Begin is going to be elected prime minister. And as Israel starts to become that little bit more individualistic, we start to see changes in these graves. And one person who's buried here is Yoni Netanyahu, Bibi's brother, of course. And we see something that didn't exist. And here, and let's be clear, this is absolutely deserved, but we see something here that was not present on graves in 1948. And that Yoni here, it tells us Yoni Netanyahu has been given the highest medal of honor in the IDF for bravery. That was something that existed back in 1948, but it wasn't put on the graves because you should have been individual there should have been no distinction. If you fell in battle, it didn't matter whether you'd fallen extremely bravely or whether you'd been shot by a sniper in your sleep. It didn't matter. But by the 1970s, there's this push for individualization. And one place we see it is on Yoni's grave. Yoni Netanyahu, I assume we all know the story, but Yoni Netanyahu, of course, is the hero of Entebbe. A plane is hijacked and taken to Uganda, a plane with many Israelis on board. The Israeli government authorizes a rescue mission where the Israelis land in Entebbe. They're disguised as the dictator Idi Amin and his entourage. They burst into the passenger terminal where the hostages are being held, and they free most of them. Yoni is the only soldier killed in that mission. He's also the commander of the operation. A couple of things people might not know. One is that the reason that the terrorists actually flew to Uganda was because 4 years earlier, a plane had been hijacked and had been flown back to Ben Gurion Airport, Lod Airport as it was then known, and that plane was also, the hijackers were also overpowered there by a force from the same unit, Sayeret Matkal. And the force that overpowered the hijackers back in 1972 was commanded by Ehud Barak, and his deputy was Benjamin Netanyahu. So that, I think, is something that was interesting. Yoni Netanyahu desperately wanted to be part of that mission, but Barak gave an order that two brothers couldn't both take part in a mission that was considered very dangerous, so that the parents wouldn't suffer two children being killed at once. Bibi Netanyahu, by the way, at this point, this is 1976. Bibi Netanyahu is in America. He's working, if I remember right, at the Boston Consulting Group, and he's very publicly saying that he wants to stay in America for a business career. And that changes drastically with the death of Yoni, obviously. Yoni was the commander of Sayeret Matkali. He was the youngest lieutenant colonel in the IDF, as far as I'm aware. And I believe it is I believe that it is very, very likely that he would have reached a very high position in the army, and may have been the famous. He may be the more famous of the Netanyahus even today, but he would have been a very, very famous Netanyahu in his own right had he lived as well. Now, next to something that I think is interesting, and we did touch on this earlier, but right next to Yoni is someone else that people should know, really should know, but no one does. There's Yoni Netanyahu, and if we just go across the slightest bit, bear with me, at least I hope. We get to the man buried next to him, and it's a little bit hard to read, but this man's name is David Elazar. David Elazar was the chief of the IDF in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, the chief of staff. We said earlier that generals have the right to be buried on Mount Hertzel. David Elazar dies in 1976, and he's buried in the next plot that's available, which by chance happens to be next to Yoni Netanyahu. They both die in 1976. David Elazar, many people today say was the greatest. Many say he may have been the greatest soldier Israel ever had. He was the commander of the Northern Front in 1967 when we captured the Golan Heights. In 1973, we now know that he warned that there was a surprise attack coming in the lead up to Yom Kippur and wanted to launch a preemptive strike. At the time, however, and we also know from cabinet minutes that David Elazar and Golder actually both functioned extremely well during the Yom Kippur War, and that they made the best decisions available on the information available to them once the war began. Elazar did that prior to the war as well in many respects, but he also took a lot of the blame for the war at the time. He's forced out of the army not long after the war. He becomes a very broken man. He dies 5 years later. The chief of staff is generally a pretty young, fit person. He dies young. And to this day, I think there's a sadness in that everyone comes and visits Yoni Netanyahu's grave. Everyone. And nobody mentions David Elazar. It's literally, you don't even have to move. You can literally see one from the other. I didn't know that they were buried next to each other until, for years, I was doing this. I would do this tour. I would come on tours here, and suddenly one day I just looked across and I see David Elazar, and Rav Aluf, head chief of staff, and I was really, really surprised because no one ever mentioned him. And I think that the man gave he didn't die in battle, but he sacrificed the vast majority of his life in the service of the state and the IDF, and I think he should be acknowledged as well. Questions before I continue? Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to take you back to our narrative about this change that we're seeing in the graves. And once we're now coming up into the area around a more recent area of the cemetery. And I want again to show you some of, just to play this video as without the sound, but I want you to see this continuation of individuality. Israel is moving away from being a collectivist society. It's becoming more and more individual. And we're seeing that in how it commemorates its soldiers and how the soldiers themselves choose to be buried on Mount Hertzel. Immediately on the grave right on the right, I see another plaque which has personal inscriptions. You see the cactuses on the grave on the left of screen. You see flowers that have been placed there by the family. This would not have happened previously. Flowers are not, it goes against Jewish tradition in many ways. Here we have this keyboard that the family has painted and placed on the grave. Pot plants, hearts. None of this would have happened previously. And now I want to show you one more grave. Oh, we have a photo of a soldier, which is completely unheard of previously. And then we come here and look at this. This is the grave of a soldier by the name of Michael Levine. Many of you may know of him. Michael Levine comes he fell in the Second Lebanon War in 2006. Michael Levine comes to Israel on birthright from Philadelphia. And he comes from Philadelphia, from the US. He comes here on birthright. he decides while he's here that he believes that it's the responsibility of all Jews to defend the state of Israel and Jews worldwide. He goes back and comes back to Israel, joins the IDF. In 2006, Mike Levine is, one thing that the IDF does for lone soldiers is that these days at least, is that it actually gives them a ticket to go home once I think it's once a year. It might be slightly less frequent than that, but it gives them a ticket to go home and visit their family. And when the Second Lebanon War breaks out in 2006, Michael Levine is actually in Philadelphia with his family. And he hears about the war. He calls his commander and he says, how do I get back? And the commander says to him, the commander actually talks to him for a while in the heat of, during a war. And he says to him, Michael, this is not 1948. The state is not going to be destroyed. We have more soldiers than we need. We've got this. Enjoy your holiday. See you afterwards. Wish us luck. And Michael Levine says, okay. He tells his commander that that's okay. And he then gets on a plane without telling anyone and without telling his commander at least, and comes back to Israel. From what we know, when he gets to Ben Gurion Airport, he hitchhikes up to a command post, a northern, he hitchhikes to the north. He goes into an area where they have supplies and things. He explains who he is. He gets a uniform and he gets equipment, and then he goes in with one of the units into Lebanon. He's killed in battle, and that is how he falls. Now, that to me is not the end of the story, because Michael Levine's parents hear that he's died in battle, and the Israeli government obviously flies them here for his funeral. And on the way here, Michael Levine's mother is very, very, she talks about this. She was very, very concerned because they didn't actually have any family in Israel, at least as far as I'm aware. They didn't know many people. And she was convinced that there wouldn't be a minyan at the funeral. And this is worrying her the whole way here. When she gets here, she tells the officer who collects them about this. And while they're actually on their way up to Jerusalem, the officer says, leave it with me. And he puts in a call to the Israeli radio, to Israel radio, to Galgalatz, Galei Tzahal, Army Radio. And he says, for anyone who doesn't know, who doesn't live in Israel, it's called Army Radio. It's the most popular station in Israel today, I think. It's not really military in any real way. But he calls Galgalatz and he says, the soldier driving them up says, there's this lone soldier that's fallen in battle in Lebanon, and we're worried there's not going to be 10 Jewish males to bury him. That's a minyan for anyone who doesn't know. And it would be great if anyone could come and help. By the time the funeral starts, there is an estimate. By the time the funeral starts, it's pretty busy here. We have estimated numbers of 25 to 45,000 people, depending on whether you only count the men who came for the minyan or whether you count the women and children who came with them as well. In any case, I think that it's very, very significant that there was this honoring of Michael Levine. And I think that it, to me at least, and you don't have to agree with me, but I think it certainly shows, one, that Israelis have an enormous amount of respect for anyone in the Jewish diaspora who comes to try and serve and defend the country, and has respect for soldiers generally. They did not want this boy to be buried without proper honor. And I also think that there is also obviously a very, very strong connection between Michael, who believes he's defending the entire Jewish world by serving in the Israeli Defense Force. Now, the grave looks like this both because by 2006 we have a much, much higher degree of individualization. We see that in the graves all around us, and also because this becomes almost like a site of pilgrimage for many birthright groups. They come here to tell Michael's story. They come here, and that in of itself is going to bring us to something else that's going to happen with these graves. Israel, the government of Israel, the IDF, they leave this as it is. They do not stop anyone putting anything on these graves. Any questions or comments just before I move on? There is Michael in a close-up photo, by the way. Sorry, I'm struggling to hold it there, but we did see Michael for a second. Are there any questions via the chat before I continue on? yeah, I see comments of an amazing story. I really do believe it is an amazing story. What I'm going to do now is actually jump. We're not going to use we're going to go back into this PowerPoint presentation we started with. And I want to tell you why. We're continuing with our story, but we actually went to film at the next grave. And as we got there, there was a family that was basically kind of like they were sitting around the grave, remembering their loved one. The mother was kind of like almost like gardening, for lack of a better word. She was trimming the hedge on the grave itself. And obviously, we didn't want to impose. We didn't want to start photographing a family in their private moment. So instead, I took footage that I have from previous tours that weren't being recorded, previous tours when we were actually at the site. I mention that because I think at the end of the day, these are stories, and I hope that you're identifying with them. But I also think that we need to remember that this is a very real. This is not. This is real. These are people's sons and their daughters, and in some cases, fathers and mothers and partners who are here, and we need to understand that these are stories, but they're very real stories. So I mentioned that. But in any case, I want to bring you to this section of the cemetery now, and I want to remind you of Yigael Yadin and 2 dots under his name. This is now the section from around 2008 onwards. And by the way, if you look closely, there are these 2 soldiers that we see with the photos, which you would never have seen earlier. For those who don't read Hebrew, on the grave on the center of screen, the one above the soldier with 2 portraits, we see someone's put says Yom Huledet Sameach, happy birthday, someone's bought that. We see the different flags. We see all of this. We also see on that central grave, if we look closely, I can see he fell in 2012. And he was born in 1992. So this soldier is younger than me and I think probably most people on this tour. We start to see more women, which in 1948, we had a high number of women killed. The IDF was a very egalitarian military in 1948, but then for many, many years, that was not the case. And more recently, women have begun serving in more combat-related roles again. And the overwhelming feeling we get is just how different this looks from Yigael Yadin and the early part of the state. And I want to keep going with that. And this is kind of like where our story ends in terms of how Israeli society has changed and how it's reflected here. I'll keep showing you more of these. The soldier here in we have one more soldier in the center here. His name is Max Steinberg. He's also a lone soldier, and there's a very similar story with him to that of Michael Levine. But there are many, many people who turn up at his grave. And then we have the grave in the center here. This is a soldier named Limat. And what we notice about Limat's grave is that there is no memorial stone on it. It's obviously very, very different. Limat, this is where our story ends in terms of changing nature of Israel and its society and a pushback. Limat dies in the Gaza war in 2014, and Limat's parents come to the state and they say, every grave says this person fell and the name of his parents, and Limat's parents say they also want to write the siblings' names and his grandparents' names. And for whatever reason, the state of Israel says, Chalas, enough. We started with 2 dots underneath Yigael Yadin's name. And sorry, my son has woken up, but we started with 2 dots under Yigael Yadin's name. And now we've got these pictures and we've got flags and we've got happy birthday and no. Okay, please get him out of here. This is where we draw the line. We cannot put the names of the siblings and the grandparents because it'll just continue running wild. Enough. No. And Limat's parents say, okay, if you're not going to put the other names on the grave, we don't want a memorial stone at all. And it's left that way. And for a period of time, you have nothing on this grave. And then one night, some of his friends come into the cemetery and they put a big surfboard in the ground because his big love in life was surfing. And that's kind of where we are. These are the last that's where we are now. To me, you know, there are stories, there's this tension between everyone being equal in death, and also the need to preserve the memory of individuals and of our soldiers. And I think that, I don't know why Israel chose this as the place to draw the line, but it's an interesting place to have drawn it. And I think that the surfboard in of itself is very, very interesting. The fact that Israel has not removed the surfboard after saying no is also interesting in of itself. I'm going to leave it there with one final comment, and that is this. I think that someone once told me that every generation has their own section that they feel connected to in the cemetery. And if I'd been here if I'd been born in Israel, I think it would have been 2006. I was 20 years old in 2006. I probably would have been a soldier in the Second Lebanon War, and I would have known a lot of the people who died there, but I wasn't. I made Aliyah years later. And for me, you know, I think what is my area of the cemetery, for lack of a better term, it's really this last area we're in, because I remember these guys. I remember seeing these photos on the news in 2014. I remember hearing their stories. I don't know any of them personally, but I know a lot of their friends. I know one of their girlfriends I actually know quite well. I studied when I did the tour. I've studied when I, not when I did my tour guide course, but when I did another course in Israel, I studied with the brother of one of these guys. I know people well who are connected to them. And to me, this is kind of like my area. And I think that it's very, very sad that to this day, every generation of Israelis has what they would call their area of Mount Hertzel of the cemetery. With that, I think that I will close. I hope that has been interesting to everyone. Again, I hate to do this, but we really, you know, my tour company, my whole staff is basically are not working at the moment. We're not paying anyone. So if anyone has enjoyed this and can help with tips and has enjoyed this tour, that would be much appreciated. And I'm going to do something similar, I think, next week sometime. As I said at the start, we're going to go down to the Gaza border. We have a former commander of Israeli soldiers on the border who's agreed to talk from various vantage points, like I've done, and then also to take questions live. And we're also potentially going to speak to residents and that sort of thing. I hope you'll join for that too. I will post in the event page on Facebook. I will send I'll send a link to the video itself. Happy to take any comments. If anyone doesn't have Facebook, I know there are a few people. I'm available on WhatsApp, and I'm just I'll post my number here now. The other thing is, there is talk for those in Israel that I heard last night that the government is planning to start allowing hotels and Zimmerim to start opening in the next couple of weeks. When that happens, for those who feel they need to get out, I know that Israelis don't generally. You can definitely send a tip on Bit, and for those who generally, I'm set up on Bit, aren't I? I'm just asking my wife. Correct? Yes. If not, I'll repost there's a PayPal link as well, which I've just reposted. One other thing I want to say, guys, as I said, I do have some guides that work with me, etc. We are hoping that once these national parks and things open, presumably there still won't be tourists coming in. If everyone does want to get out and thinks they could benefit from having a guide with them, I would love to either be able to guide or to send some of the guides I work with out into the field to earn some money. Some of them have kids and families and things like that. So I would love for anyone who's interested to be in touch about that as well, once we can move around a little bit more freely. Guys, thank you very much. There's my WhatsApp number and the PayPal link again, and really appreciate it. I hope you got something out of that. I'll stay online for a few minutes if there's any more questions or comments. I also understand that Zara, who's on the group, asked me to say that she may be writing an article and may want some comments about anyone who is on here, and if anyone's happy to do that, please send me a message as well, and I'll pass your details between one another.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you. I'm happy for people to unmute themselves, but
Thanks very much, Josh. Amazing.
no problem. Thank you.
And yeah, if you can post the link to the video, that'd be great.
Thank you. I said something at the beginning when volume wasn't good. At the beginning, what I most likely said was two things. One, that Mount Hertzel was not the natural place for soldiers and leaders to be buried. That would have been the Mount of Olives. But Ben-Gurion, in the midst of the War of Independence, realizes the Mount of Olives is fallen to Jordan, and he's got to find another place. And he picks this random hill in West Jerusalem that doesn't actually have much significance, but he's going to transform it into this place of pilgrimage. And very often you'll hear tour guides start by saying, you know, a leader, like twice in history, a leader named David has taken a mountain in Jerusalem and has made it a place of pilgrimage for the Jewish people. It's not actually true, because King David, they're talking about the Temple Mount. King David never built on the Temple Mount, but there is a feeling that Mount Hertzel has become almost like this place of pilgrimage for modern Israel. That's one thing that you often hear. The other thing that I said is that Mount Hertzel is on top of Yad Vashem. It's actually part of a bigger complex called Mount Memorial, or Memorial Mountain. And it's interesting that the state of Israel chooses to put Mount Hertzel on top of Yad Vashem. Everything is very symbolic here, and you can disagree with this. And I don't know if Israel would do it today, but in 1948, Ben-Gurion has a very clear view. Ben-Gurion, and through the next couple of decades, up until the Eichmann trial, I'd say, there is a very clear view that it is much higher, it's much more noble to go down fighting for Israel, to not be the weak-kneed Jew, to go down battling for independence and defending yourself and defending Jews, than it is to go like sheep to the slaughter in the Holocaust. Of course, today we know that's not what happened in the Holocaust, but that is something that they have to live with the way that this whole place was designed. So yeah, very controversial today. The bottom line is we can't change it today, and I don't think the government of Israel wants to change it. They could theoretically move Yad Vashem. It would be a huge investment. I don't think they want to do that. Because I'll just finish by saying they don't want to do that, because when you come on a particular type of tour, usually Taglit, what you will do is you will go to Yad Vashem, and then you will walk along something called the connecting path, which takes you through kind of like the edge of the forest, up from Mount Hertzel from Yad Vashem to Mount Hertzel on foot. And I actually don't like doing that as a tour guide. To me, it's too propaganda-ish. But they do it with birthright, and obviously what they're saying to these kids from the diaspora is that the Israeli soldiers who have fallen are what is preventing the Holocaust from happening again. That may be true, by the way. I just personally, personally as a guide, I prefer people to come to that conclusion themselves. But for that reason, I don't think the state of Israel will ever move. Sorry, my daughter is also making some noise now, but that is something that the state of Israel would not move because of that reason, I think. Any other questions? All right, guys, I will log off. Thank you very, very much for taking part. I enjoyed it. I hope you all did as well. Thank you. I'll stay online, but I'll mute myself, and I'll mute myself now. Thanks. My number.
סגרתי לך את הוידאו.
אוקיי.
אתה לא מיוט. אבא.